Imagine you are lying in a bed, too weak to move, watching a vine through a cold window. One by one the leaves are falling, and you have decided, quietly, with perfect certainty, that when the last leaf falls, you will die. This is a story about that leaf, about a dying girl, a devoted friend, and an old man with a secret. A story about what one small act of love can do. Welcome to The Last Leaf by O. Henry. Chapter 1. A City of Crooked Streets. In the western part of Greenwich Village, the streets go a little wild. They twist and turn unexpectedly, cutting across each other at strange angles, forming small, irregular corners. It is the kind of neighborhood where order gave up long ago, and perhaps that is exactly why artists came to live here. For artists, you see, have never been very comfortable with straight lines. This was Greenwich Village at the turn of the 20th century. The streets were narrow and often wet with autumn rain. Old brick buildings leaned close together as if sharing secrets. Gas lamps flickered in the evenings, casting long orange shadows across the cobblestones. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp leaves and something harder to name, something like ambition, or perhaps loneliness, or perhaps both at once. It was here, in this neighborhood of crooked streets and impractical dreams, that two young women had made their home. Their names were Sue and Johnsy. Sue came from Maine, practical, warm, with a steady hand and a steadier heart. Johnsy had come from California, quieter, more inward, with a painter's eye for color and light and the melancholy beauty of fading things. They had met at a small cafe on 8th Street, discovered that they shared the same taste in food, art, and the color of their autumn coats, and had decided on the spot to rent a studio together. The studio was at the top of a 3-story building, a single large room with wide windows and bare floors, and the constant sound of the city below. It was impractical, drafty, and perfect. They painted there, they hung their canvases on the walls, they cooked simple meals and drank cheap coffee, and talked late into the night about the paintings they would one day make, paintings that would be famous, paintings that would matter. Johnsy would talk sometimes about going to Europe, about Italy, about the light on the water in the Bay of Naples that she had seen once in a photograph and never quite been able to forget. She would paint it herself one day, she said, and she said it the way you say things when you are young and the future is simply a matter of getting there. They were young. They believed fully in the future. That is a wonderful thing to believe in, while it lasts. Chapter 2. The Shadow of November. November arrived in New York that year the way illness sometimes arrives. Quietly at first, almost unnoticed, and then with sudden force. The temperature dropped. The sky became the color of old pewter. Rain fell for days without stopping. Not the generous summer rain that refreshes, but a cold, thin, persistent rain that crept through windows and settled into bone. It was in this grey and relentless November that pneumonia came to Greenwich Village. O. Henry tells us that pneumonia was no gentleman. He was right. The disease moved through the narrow streets without pity, entering where it wished, taking whom it chose, with no regard for youth or talent or the paintings still waiting to be made. Johnsy was among those it chose. One morning she did not get up. By afternoon she could not. By evening she was lying in the narrow iron bed by the window, pale and still, and breathing with a careful, measured effort that frightened Sue more than any words could say. The doctor came. He was a kind man with tired eyes and an honest face. He examined Johnsy with gentle thoroughness, listened to her chest, took her temperature, and then stepped into the hallway with Sue. He spoke quietly. "Pneumonia," he said. "Serious. The odds were not in her favor. He put the chance of recovery at about 1 in 10. But then he paused, and he said something that Sue would not forget. He said that medicine could only do so much. The rest, he said, depended on the patient. It depended on whether she wanted to get well. Sue stood in the hallway after he left and held very still. She was not the kind of person who fell apart easily. But in that moment, alone in the dim corridor, with the rain tapping against the window at the end of the hall, she allowed herself a few seconds of pure, wordless fear. Then she squared her shoulders. She went back into the room. She sat down beside Johnsy and picked up her drawing work and began to work steadily, because that was what she could do. The days that followed had a strange, suspended quality. The studio was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the streets with increasing determination. The last of the autumn color was being stripped from the trees. Everything was becoming bare. And Johnsy lay in her bed and looked out the window, and something in her eyes was already very far away. Chapter 3. The Counting of Leaves. Outside the window of the studio, climbing up the old brick wall of the building across the narrow courtyard, grew an ivy vine. It was ancient, as city vines go, its trunk as thick as a man's wrist at the base, its branches spreading across the wall in a dark and complicated network. In summer it had been dense and green, but November had been working on it steadily, and now only a handful of leaves remained, clinging to the vine with a kind of stubborn, exhausted patience. One morning Sue came into the room to find Johnsy lying with her eyes open, staring out at the wall and the vine, her lips moving very slightly. Sue listened. She was counting. 1, 2, 3. The numbers came out slow and soft, barely above a whisper, spoken with the peculiar calm of someone who has made a decision and is no longer afraid of it. Sue drew her chair close. She asked quietly what Johnsy was counting. Johnsy turned her head on the pillow and looked at her, not with distress, but with the gentle patience of someone explaining something obvious. "The leaves," she said, "on the ivy vine." She had been watching them fall. There were not many left. When the last one fell, she said, she would go too. Sue felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November air. She kept her voice steady. She told Johnsy that was foolish. She said that ivy leaves had nothing to do with people's lives. She said the doctor had told her this morning the chances were improving, 10 to 1 now in Johnsy's favor. She invented that last part. But the numbers did not reach Johnsy. Her eyes had already drifted back to the window. This is the thing about grief and illness and the darkening of the mind. Sometimes the sufferer finds an idea to attach their surrender to. Not because the idea is true, but because the mind, when it is very tired, needs something concrete to hold on to. Johnsy had chosen the ivy leaves. They were visible, they were countable, they were falling, and in their falling she had found permission. Sue went to the other side of the room. She pulled out her drawing board and worked, but her eyes kept moving back to Johnsy's still figure by the window. She watched the leaves. She counted them herself. There were 4, maybe 5. It was hard to tell from across the room, but not many. Each gust of wind against the glass made her look up with a tightening in her chest. She tried talking to Johnsy about other things, about her work, about a commission for a magazine illustration, about a neighbor's cat that had been making noise on the stairway. Johnsy listened politely and said little. Her eyes kept returning to the vine. Whatever place Johnsy was going to in her mind, it was somewhere beyond the reach of conversation, and that was what frightened Sue most of all. Chapter 4. Sue's Vigil. There are all kinds of courage in this world. There is the courage of soldiers and explorers, the dramatic courage of great decisions made in difficult moments. But there is another kind, quieter, less celebrated, and perhaps more demanding. The courage of simply staying, of continuing to show up day after day beside someone who is slipping away, with nothing to offer but your presence and your refusal to stop caring. This was Sue's courage. She cooked soups that Johnsy barely tasted. She kept the small stove burning so the room stayed warm. She pulled the curtain partly across the window in the hope that Johnsy might forget the vine for a while. But Johnsy always asked her to pull it back. She wanted to see. And so the curtain went back and the vine remained in view and the leaves continued to fall. Sue worked at her drawing board for long hours, taking magazine commissions to pay for the doctor, the medicine, the coal. She drew illustrations for stories about fashionable women in fine clothes, images as far as possible from the cold, bare room where she sat, and from the still figure of her friend in the bed. But she drew carefully and well. She had to. They needed the money. At night she slept lightly, always with one ear open. Several times she woke to the sound of wind and lay in the dark, listening, wondering if this was the night the last leaf would go. She lay still and breathed and told herself it would be all right. She was not certain she believed it, but she kept saying it because to stop saying it felt like giving something up that she could not afford to give. She also talked to Johnsy, not always about important things, sometimes about small things, the sound of rain on the roof, a color she had noticed in the sky that morning, something she had read. She talked because silence felt dangerous. She talked because the sound of a human voice, even speaking of nothing much, is a kind of company for the soul. And Jonesy's soul, she sensed, needed company. One afternoon, Johnsy said something that stopped Sue's pencil mid-stroke. She said she wanted to paint the Bay of Naples someday. She had always wanted to see Italy. She mentioned it simply, almost as an afterthought, the way you might mention something you have long since stopped believing possible. But Sue held on to it. It was a future. It was a direction. She turned it over carefully in her heart like a small, fragile thing that needed protecting. Chapter 5. The Old Man Downstairs. In the studio below the one where Johnsy and Sue lived, there was an old man named Bearman. He had lived in the building for so long that no one could quite remember a time before him. He was a painter, or rather he had been a painter, and still called himself one, though the evidence of recent work was difficult to find. His studio smelled of turpentine and old paint and the strong tobacco he was always smoking. Behrman was over 60 years old, with a white beard that he had never quite brought under control, and the kind of face that has lived intensely, deeply lined, expressive, full of the residue of old passions and disappointments. He had come to America from Germany in his youth, full of fire, certain that greatness was ahead of him. He would paint a masterpiece. He had always intended to paint a masterpiece. The masterpiece had not yet arrived. He earned small amounts of money posing as a model for the younger artists in the neighborhood, sitting very still with an expression of exaggerated ferocity that made the students laugh. He drank too much gin. He was loud and argumentative at times, fond of declaring that certain kinds of sentiment in art were weakness, that real painting required iron nerves and a ruthless eye. He said these things with great force. He believed exactly the opposite. Beneath the bluster, beneath the gin and the loud opinions, Behrman was deeply, fiercely tender. He loved the young artists in the building with the protective ferocity of a man who has no children and has transferred all that unexpended love onto the nearest worthy object. He watched over them without quite admitting it. He worried about them without quite saying so. He would have done almost anything for them had anyone ever thought to ask. Sue went downstairs to see him one evening. She needed to use him as a model for the illustration she was working on, an old miner, bearded and weather-beaten. He grumbled about this in his usual fashion, settling into his chair with theatrical reluctance. But as she sketched him, she talked. She told him about Johnsy, about the leaves, about what the doctor had said. She kept her voice steady, but her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady on the page. Behrman listened in silence. This was unusual for him. He was not normally a silent man. But as Sue spoke, the expression on his face changed. The loudness went out of him. He sat very still, with his big, rough hands folded in his lap, and something moved behind his eye. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said it was foolish, it was stupidity. He said it without conviction, as if saying it might make it less frightening. Chapter 6. A Masterpiece Unfinished. After Sue told him about Johnsy, Behrman insisted on going up to see her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the small, still figure in the bed, and at the window, and at the vine on the brick wall outside. He said nothing. He looked at the vine for a long time with those sharp, paint-stained eyes of his. Then he crossed the room and stood for a moment beside Johnsy's bed, and then came out again without having spoken. In the hallway he was very quiet. He said at last that it was poor little sick girl. He said again that it was foolish nonsense about the leaves, but his voice was different now, lower, stripped of its usual performance. Sue watched him. There was something in his face she had not seen before, or perhaps had not noticed before. A kind of concentrated, gathering seriousness, as if a decision was forming in him that he had not yet named. He went back downstairs. In his studio, his easel stood in the corner with a blank canvas on it, the same blank canvas that had stood there for years. It waited with the patient indifference of objects. Behrman had looked at it many times. He had mixed colors and stood before it, and then, each time, had put his brush down and walked away. The masterpiece always remained ahead of him, always ahead, never quite here. But Behrman had spent more than 40 years studying how things looked. He had spent decades learning how light falls on surfaces, how color changes with moisture and shadow, how texture is made with paint and patience and an honest eye. He had never used all of that accumulated knowledge for the great work he dreamed of, but he had it, It was in his hands, and he knew now, standing alone in his studio in the last of the pale November light, what it was for. He began to prepare. He did not hurry. A man who has thought about a painting for 40 years does not hurry when the moment finally comes. He looked at the ivy leaves on the wall for a long time. He looked at how they caught the last of the daylight, at the particular green of them, fading now to yellow and brown at their edges, at the way they hung from the vine's dark stems with a fragile, determined grip. Chapter 7. The Storm's Dark Work. That night the storm came in earnest. It had been building all day, a restlessness in the air, the clouds thickening and lowering over the city until the sky felt close enough to touch. By evening the wind had risen, moving through the streets with a low, continuous moan. By midnight it was a proper November gale, driving cold rain against every surface in furious, repeated volleys. Sue lay awake and listened to it. She heard the windows flex in their frames. She heard the rain against the glass, not the steady drip of earlier days, but a driving, relentless assault. She thought of the ivy vine. She thought of the last few leaves still clinging to the wall in that darkness. She pulled the blanket up and listened and tried very hard not to think. Johnsy slept through most of the storm, which was a mercy. Her breathing was shallow but even, and the small rise and fall of her chest under the blanket was the most important thing in the room. Sue checked on her twice through the night. Both times she carefully avoided looking out the window. She was not ready to know yet what had happened to the vine. Downstairs in the dark and the cold, old Bearman was out. We will not linger too long on this detail now. The story will return to it. But understand what it meant. An old man past 60 with a chest that had never been strong, going out into a violent November storm, into wind and driving rain and cold that cut through clothing as if it were paper. He was out there, working. In the morning the storm had passed. The streets were wet and strewn with debris, broken branches, scattered leaves, the remnants of the night's great fury. The sky was pale and washed clean, the color of new paper. Somewhere in the city a church bell rang, and the sound carried clearly in the still, cold air. It was that particular quiet that only comes after a storm, when the world seems to have been taken apart and put back together again. Chapter 8. The Last Leaf. When morning light came into the studio, Johnsy's eyes opened. She lay still for a moment, gathering herself. Then slowly, with the deliberateness of a person preparing to receive what they have expected, she asked Sue to raise the window blind. Sue hesitated. Her hand rested on the cord. She breathed. Then she pulled it up. There was the brick wall. There was the old vine, stripped now, its dark branches bare and rain-wet, glistening in the pale morning light. And there, clinging to the wall near the very top of the vine's reach, as if it had simply decided not to obey the storm, was a single ivy leaf. One leaf, dark green against the grey brick. Still. Johnsy looked at it for a long time. Sue stood by the window and watched Johnsy, not the leaf. She watched her friend's face, that pale and exhausted face, move through something, some internal rearrangement, slow and quiet, like ice beginning to melt. The leaf was still there. The storm had been terrible, and the leaf had not fallen. Another day passed. The leaf did not fall. Another night came, cold again with wind, though not the fury of the previous night. In the morning, the leaf was still there, exactly as it had been, its color undiminished, its grip on the wall as firm as before. It hung there with a kind of serene stubbornness that seemed, if you looked long enough, almost like a statement, almost like a message. And slowly, in that way that the spirit sometimes returns before the body has quite caught up, Johnsy began to come back. It began with something small. She asked for a looking-glass. She asked Sue to fix her hair. She mentioned that she would like, someday, to paint the Bay of Naples. And unlike the last time she had said it, this time the word someday carried weight. It had a future in it. It meant she intended to be there. She began to eat. Small amounts at first, a few spoonfuls of broth, a little bread, then more. Her color came back by slow degrees, the way color returns to a landscape after a long drought. The doctor came again, and this time his tired eyes were warmer when he looked at her. He increased the odds significantly. He said she was going to be all right. And this time it was not a hope. It was very nearly a certainty. One afternoon, when Johnsy was propped up on her pillows and already talking with something approaching her old energy, Sue sat down beside her. She took her friend's hand. She spoke carefully. She had something to tell her, and she needed Johnsy to be strong enough to hear it. Johnsy looked at her with those quiet, recovering eyes and said she was listening. That last leaf on the wall, Sue told her, it was not real. It had never been a real leaf. The night of the great storm, when every leaf from the vine had been torn away by the wind and the rain, old Berman had gone outside in the dark and the cold and the fury of the storm. He had set up his ladder against that old brick wall. He had taken his brushes and his paint, and he had painted a leaf. He had painted it with everything he knew, every lesson of 50 years of looking, of studying light and color and the texture of things. He had painted the stem and the veins. He had painted the particular green of an ivy leaf in November, the dark green of the heart fading to yellow at the edges, the subtle variation of tone across the surface. He had painted it in the rain, in the wind, in the dark, on a cold brick wall. And he had painted it so well that it had fooled the eye completely, and a dying girl had seen it and decided to live. Chapter 9. The Price of a Masterpiece. Old Berman was found the next morning. He had been ill for 2 days before anyone fully understood how serious it was. The janitor of the building had seen a light under his door late at night and heard him coughing. When the door was finally opened, they found him in his chair, unable to stand, his clothes still damp from the night of the storm. His shoes, still beside the door, were soaking wet. He was taken to hospital. The doctor who examined him was the same kind man with tired eyes who had attended Johnsy. He looked at Berman, and then he looked again, and he said the same word, pneumonia, severe. The old man had been out in a violent storm in cold and wet conditions, and his body, at 60-some years and not particularly well tended, had been unable to withstand it. The prognosis was not good. Sue went to see him. He was lying in the hospital bed, that great rumpled old man with his white beard and his paint-stained hands, looking somehow smaller than he did in his studio, the way things sometimes look smaller when removed from the context that gives them their full dimension. He was conscious but very weak. He looked at Sue with those sharp eyes and said nothing. There was nothing really left to say. Old Behrman died 2 days later. He died without seeing Johnsy recover fully, though perhaps he knew she would. He died in the white bed of a hospital ward, with the smell of disinfectant instead of turpentine around him, and the sounds of the city coming in through a window. He died as he had lived, a little roughly, a little loudly perhaps, and with the secret weight of an unexpressed love that had only ever found at the very end its perfect form of expression. They found the supplies in his studio afterward. A lantern still half full of oil, a ladder leaning against the wall, 2 brushes stiff with green paint that had dried on them and not been cleaned, and on the table the palette on which he had mixed his colors, the dark greens and the yellows, the careful range of tones he had needed to make one single leaf look absolutely, convincingly alive. And on the easel in the corner, the blank canvas that had waited there for years, still blank. The masterpiece Behrman had always planned to paint had never come to that canvas. It had gone instead to a brick wall in the rain in the dark of a November storm. It had gone instead to the eye of a dying girl who needed something to hold on to. That was where his masterpiece had ended up. That was where it belonged. Closing reflection. Why this story endures. O. Henry published The Last Leaf in 1907. More than a century has passed. The world has changed almost beyond recognition since those gaslit evenings in Greenwich Village. And yet this story is still here. It is still being read. It is still being taught. It is still, as you have perhaps found today, still capable of reaching inside the chest and doing something quiet and important there. Why? What is it that this small story contains that refuses to fade? Part of the answer is the truth it tells about illness. Not the medical facts of illness, but the emotional facts. The way the mind, when exhausted and frightened, attaches itself to symbols. The way we make meaning out of the visible world when the invisible world becomes too much to bear. Johnsy was not irrational. She was human. She needed a concrete thing to look at and to count. We all do in our darkest moments. Part of the answer is what Behrman tells us about art. Not art as decoration, not art as entertainment, though it can be both of those things, but art as an act of radical generosity. Art as something made with the full force of one's knowledge and feeling, offered completely, with no guarantee of recognition. Behrman never signed that leaf. No gallery will ever exhibit it. No critic will ever review it. And yet it is the most important painting in this story. There is also something this story tells us about the strange economy of sacrifice. Behrman gave his life so that Johnsy could keep hers. He did not do so with speeches or grand gestures. He did so with a ladder and a brush and a cold night and a refusal to let a young woman die for want of something to believe in. The sacrifice was private. It was practical. It was complete. And it was, in its own way, a kind of love poem. We also should not forget Sue. She is quieter than Behrman, her heroism less dramatic, but she is there, every day, steadily and without complaint, holding the world together around her friend. She represents the unglamorous, essential work of devotion, the showing up, the soup-making, the curtain-pulling, the storytelling, the refusal to surrender. Without Sue, Johnsy would not have survived long enough for the leaf to matter. Devotion is also, in its way, an art form. And what does the story say to us today? To those of us living in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten the value of small things, of careful things, of things made with patience and love and offered without expectation. Perhaps it says this, that the most important works of art are not always the ones that hang in museums. Sometimes they are painted in the dark, in the rain, on a cold brick wall, for an audience of one. Perhaps it says that the masterpiece you have been waiting to make may not look like what you imagined. Perhaps it will not come to the blank canvas in the corner of the studio. Perhaps it will come in a moment of sudden clarity, a moment when you understand exactly what your particular knowledge, your particular skill, your particular love is for. And in that moment, without hesitation, you act. O. Henry was a man who understood irony, the gap between what things appear to be and what they truly are. He spent his career finding those gaps and illuminating them with a warmth that was never cynical, always humane. In The Last Leaf, the irony is of the most beautiful kind. The painting that saves a life is not great because of where it hangs or who sees it. It is great because of what it does, because of what it means to the one person who needed it most. That, perhaps, is the final truth this story offers us, 100 and more years after it was written. That the value of a thing is not determined by the number of people who see it. It is determined by the depth of its effect on the people who need it. One leaf, one life saved. One old man who gave everything he had, quietly and completely, and asked for nothing in return. That was enough. That was more than enough. Thank you for joining us on English Through Great Stories. Today's story was The Last Leaf by O. Henry. If this episode found you in a moment where you needed something to hold on to, a leaf on your own cold wall of some kind, then we are glad you stayed. And we hope, like Johnsy, that you find your way back to the Bay of Naples, whatever your Bay of Naples is, wherever it waits for you.